So, writing ionic compound names that aren't in the S block are a little bit different because most D block metals will form more than one ion. That is, except for silver, cadmium, zinc, and aluminum, which will always have their respective charges. So, for the other cations in the D block, we have to figure that out based off of the anion. And then we're going to have to indicate what that charge is by a Roman numeral, and then the rest of the naming conventions apply. So here we have copper and chlorine. We know from the periodic table that chlorine has a charge of -1, which means to balance that out, copper will just have a charge of +1. So when we're writing this out, we have copper, and then we have to indicate that charge with Roman numerals in parentheses, so that's just a 1. And then the other part of the naming, chlorine, will become chloride. So then we have copper chloride. So here we have iron twice and oxygen 3 times. We know from the periodic table that oxygen has a charge of -2. And all those oxygens will have a total charge of -6. And so we had to balance that out between 2 irons. And 6 divided by 2 is 3. And so each iron will have a charge of +3. So here we have iron, 3 oxide, iron oxide. So now we have manganese and 2 oxygens. Again, with that charge of -2 comes to a total of -4. And 1 manganese, to balance it out, will just have a +4 charge. So manganese 4 oxide. Then final example for this one. We have a nickel, 1 nickel, 3 bromines. And the periodic table tells us that bromine has a charge of -1, going to a total of -3. To balance that out, nickel will have a +3 charge. So then there's nickel, 3 bromide. So now when we're working the other direction, this is nice because now we have cobalt and chlorine. And we know that chlorine has a charge of -1 from the periodic table. And here we know that cobalt has a charge of +2 because it tells us that right there. And so then when you do that little crisscross thing, you end up with COCl2. Cadmium sulfide, cadmium and sulfide. We know that sulfur has a charge of -2. And the no indication of a Roman numeral right here, we're like, what's that? Well, we know that cadmium up here always has that +2 charge. And so that would be cadmium 2, sulfur 2, with that little crisscross thing. And those two will just cancel out to make it CdS. Nickel iodide. Here we have nickel with the charge of +3, indicated by the Roman numeral. Iodine on the periodic table. It's a -1 charge. And so following that crisscrossing again, I have nickel and I3. Last one, manganese oxide. Here it's indicated that manganese has a charge of +2 by the Roman numeral. Oxygen, as we know, has a -2. So those two are going to do the same thing that the cadmium sulfide did up there and cancel out when you cross over. So you're just going to end up with Mn.